Creativity is often, in research, tied to this ability to make connections that are less obvious.
And this person is playing my wife in the show, and we kiss on stage. I think it does open up certain pathways for playing around with a relationship and what it could be like and what it could feel like in general.
The state in which I like to be in most is one of non-monogamy.
My name is Abby.
And my name is Liam, and you are listening to the Evolving Love podcast.
In this podcast, we deep dive into the topics of non-monogamy and relationships, drawing from our experiences of being consensually non-monogamous for over a decade.
Whether you're monogamous, polyamorous, curious, or anything in between, we invite you to join us for this conversation.
Let's begin. So this is a very exciting podcast episode to share with you all. We've been buzzing ever since this conversation.
Yes, what an incredible chat with the Multiamory crew.
Oh, I absolutely adore them. We've been following their podcast for such a long time. They've done so many episodes, and it's really cool. I think we feel quite familiar with them. Did you would have felt that too, Liam?
Oh, definitely. I felt the parasocial relationship in full swing.
Yeah, I mean, their podcast has been so incredibly helpful, for me personally, and I know for you over the years to tune into specific episodes. It's not a podcast where I've listened to it from beginning to end. I feel like it's one where I check in with, if I've got something going on, if I need some sort of support or some knowledge around if I'm a hinge partner, or if we're talking about couple privilege ethics, or if there's some jealousy thing or compersion, I sort of dip in and out. Is that the way that you've approached their podcast?
I think they're almost up to 500 podcasts, which is really incredible. And they've had such a positive impact on non-monogamous people around the world looking for these amazing resources to be able to tap into and check out. So It was an incredible thing to be able to have a chat with them. And we have been buzzing ever since. Yeah,
they're incredibly smart, wise, and just really cool, down-to-earth people. And it was really awesome. And we've had another amazing podcast experience. A week and a half ago, we were guests on Christopher Ryan's podcast, Tangentially Speaking. So Christopher Ryan, who is, we've had him on our podcast before. He's the author of Sex at Dawn and Civilized to Death. Brilliant man, brilliant mind, and it was such an honor to be invited onto his podcast, and it was a deep dive.
Oh, I mean, it was amazing to be on the receiving end of the questions rather than asking him questions, and he really had some great questions for us, which was a lot of fun. I think the conversation ended up going for about 2 hours, and then we kept on chatting afterwards as well. So that does exist on his podcast. So we do invite people to go and check that one out as well.
Yeah, please do. Today's episode features Jase, Emily, and Dedeker from the renowned Multiamory podcast. With hundreds of episodes, millions of downloads around the world, and a thriving community, Multiamory has been featured in numerous publications including NPR, Vice, Huffington Post, Cosmopolitan, Elle, and more.
Emily, Dedeker, and Jase believe in looking to the future of relationships, not maintaining the status quo of the past. They value ethics over tradition and believe that a healthy world is one where everybody has agency in their relationships.
In addition to their incredible podcast, they released their critically acclaimed book, Multiamory: Essential Tools for Modern Relationships, in 2023. This book is a curated collection of the most popular communication tools, advice, and wisdom from the Multiamory podcast.
In today's episode, we discuss Emily's recent transition back to non-monogamy from a long-term monogamous relationship, the history of Dedeker, Jase, and Emily's own romantic relationship, connections between creativity and non-monogamy, links between communication styles and music, how the success of Multiamory has impacted their own personal dating lives, Jase and Dedeker finding non-monogamous community in Japan, and so much more. And with that, we bring you Jase, Dedeker, and Emily.
Dedeker, Jase, and Emily, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Now, you have had Multiamory podcast happening since 2014. Liam and I, we have been together since 2012, but we started opening up in 2014.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
I wish that we knew about the
only.
Multiamory podcast then. We discovered it years later. But it's been incredibly interesting, and we've been reflecting back on some of these, these earlier, times and explorations in our non-monogamous journey, and how sort of, looking back, we were so clueless and so well-intentioned, and we didn't have any of the language for anything. We didn't know what compersion was. We were definitely feeling some sort of embodied compersion. We didn't know about attitudinal compersion or the philosophies, relationship philosophies with non-monogamy. We were really sort of stumbling around in the dark. I think at one point we even we went on Craigslist.
Yeah, we used Craigslist as our way to try and meet people.
Wow.
Just to chat with people, I think, just to sort of find, navigate some of these conversations. So it's really interesting for us to think back to that time. So 2014 was a while ago. You've had hundreds of episodes since then. Would you mind giving us a snapshot into where you were in your non-monogamous polyamory journey then and where you are now?
Jase and I were once upon a time in a monogamous relationship together. We ended up, for a series of reasons, kind of just feeling as though maybe we should break up. Maybe we don't really know where this is going. We were living together at the time, but I sort of realized after a series of conversations, after a brief breakup, that we were really finally speaking very, I think, honestly with one another about what it was that each of us wanted and needed in a way that we hadn't been when we were sort of in our monogamous relationship. And one of the things that came up was that Jase had always sort of been interested in non-monogamy and had learned about it when he was younger, read Stranger in a Strange Land, and
Right.
always was kind of a little bit interested in it. And something that I've talked about a little bit recently, Jase, is the fact that you said to me, I love you and I care about you, but I know you're not going to be the last person that I sleep with. And that's really stuck with me since then. And I think this was back in 2013. And so we opened up our relationship, and it was, we decided we did want to stay together, and we ended up opening it up, and we met Dedeker through, I guess, OkCupid.
Well, so then my origin story was happening in parallel, right? I had first started getting intrigued by non-monogamy around 2010, 2011. I had my very first, monogamous relationship that I then opened up, and then it was a total disaster and imploded. But then on the other side of that implosion, I didn't have the, oh boy, that was a failed experiment, time to retreat back to normalcy. I had more of a, okay, that really sucked, but I also felt more like myself than I had ever in my life. And so now how do I figure out how to actually do this well, right? So I think around 2011 or so was, I think I began my, I guess I like to call it my research phase. And for me, that was poking around in LiveJournal back in the day. You know, these super dusty corners of the internet, right? Just to try to find some resources. But then fast forward to when I was in my first, I guess I would say, actual polyamorous relationship, my partner at the time, who I was living with, went on a first date with Emily. And so that's how I ended up meeting the two of them. And we ended up, Abby, I appreciate you talking about this, being so naive and well-intentioned, because I think that's where we all were. The four of us ended up kind of in a quad relationship for a while that again, was so well-intentioned.
It went well for a while.
Yeah, it was great for a while.
And then eventually it didn't.
Yeah. Jase, do you want to take over the storytelling from there? 'Cause that's kind of when you swoop in and then it's your fault for suggesting that we do a podcast.
Right. Yeah. Okay. We should get to the podcast part. Right. So during this time when everything's going well and we've got this quad, I was the one who said, hey, what if we made a podcast? Because I'd loved podcasts for a while before that. I guess I was an early adopter of podcasts, and I really wanted to do one. And also at the time, there were no podcast resources at all about non-monogamy, really. There was
Polyamory Weekly,
which is not running anymore, but they'd been running for, I don't know, 10 years before we even started ours, which is amazing. That they were the super early adopters. But it was, they were more one generation older than us. They were more solidly the kind of older Gen X, whereas we were kind of in the older to mid millennial age range. And so yeah, we decided to start the show. And one of the early decisions we made was this debate of, do we use our real names or do we use pseudonyms, which Polyamory Weekly, they use pseudonyms, right? They use fake names because they didn't want to risk their real jobs and things like that.
And a lot of creators and like people talking about non-monogamy on the internet back then were using pseudonyms for the most part.
I think it was also coming out of a time when we all used a lot more pseudonyms in the earlier days of the internet. That was just like the cool thing to do. And so we made this decision to use our actual names because we wanted the message of our show to be, hey, this isn't just this kind of thing you do in the dark. It's not just this sex thing that you can't talk about at work. It's like, hey, these are also your relationships. It's like, what, you know, it's like saying, oh, you shouldn't wear a wedding ring because you're telling everyone you have sex with this one person. Like that's absurd. Most people wouldn't think that way. And so we wanted to put it out there that polyamory doesn't have to be like that either. Like it is a thing that's a part of your life in the same way that any relationship is.
Did you find when you were going through those initial chats of when you were starting the podcast and you were thinking about going public and face out and all these things, did your particular work environments all inform that decision in a way that you all felt comfortable telling your colleagues, depending on what professions you were in at the time? Or were there kind of differing levels of comfort with actually being, because it's quite remarkable that all three of you were able to feel in that safe position where you could actually use your names and could actually come out with your faces out?
I think at the time, the three of us were very much in sort of freelance, not really necessarily doing anything where we felt like we couldn't come out. I was working in restaurants and, you know, acting and auditioning. Dedeker, you were also doing like freelance motion capture stuff and modeling and...
Yeah, motion capture and dance and modeling. Like all of us were in the entertainment industry.
Yeah.
You know, so maybe a little bit less of a, maybe a little bit less, maybe I think we felt less risk directly tied because it's kind of like, especially for the three of us, it's like we're already living paycheck to paycheck, you know, like we're already living in a risky place. My partner that I was living with at the time, he did not want to be on the podcast. And I think that was part of it, was he was just like not ready, even though he worked in the entertainment industry as well, but he was like definitely not ready to be out in that way and to like have his name and his face attached to that.
Did you do a little test with some of your friends where you said, hey, I'm thinking about starting this podcast, just to see the reaction, just to see if it felt like a safe place? Or did you just go, we're all in, let's just do this?
Well, I mean, no. First answer is no. We didn't really do that. But also you have to remember that at the time in 2014, not as many people knew about podcasts or listened to them. So I could see a lot of people going, I don't know, what? Like, who would listen to internet radio? Like, no one does that. I don't know that. So
it's also Los Angeles. And so it's like literally everyone is like, I'm making a web series. I'm doing this. I'm doing the right. So like, I don't know. Yeah, I guess it didn't occur to us at the time to actually run it by other people.
Yeah.
But here we are. But also to get back to like our journey, you know, not long after launching the podcast, like very long story short, the quad fell apart. You know, like Emily and Jase broke up and moved out. Like I think maybe 6 months after that was when I ended up breaking up with my live-in partner and moving out. And then we kind of got a little bit, well, I was going to say we all got scattered to the four winds, but we didn't really. I scattered myself to the four winds. Like I became like a digital nomad for about 5 years or so, you know, like got rid of my apartment in LA and just like had a backpack and just kind of like went. That was when I first started working on my first book as well around that time. And then I don't know, like the thing that like the transition time that we like to talk about on the podcast was this sort of weird transition time where like there's been this big shakeup of what all the relationships were, right? So it was this weird thing where like Jase and I were still in a relationship, but then like, you know, Emily and I had a breakup, Emily and Jase had a breakup, but even despite that, we still were recording the podcast together, which, you know, I mean, a lot of people are like, were you insane? Like, how did you How did you do that? How did you get through that?
Did it almost feel like public therapy? Like you were doing these therapy sessions? It's like the Esther Perel podcast where she, has these amazing therapy sessions. Did you feel like there was an added vulnerability with having those discussions in public?
Thankfully, our show is fairly evergreen, and we tried to kind of focus on topics specifically that are kind of for everyone. But I do think that all of the skills that we were learning on the show every single week about communication and how to just talk to each other well were serving us in our actual real lives and, helping us work through the emotions that we were having. And it was really difficult. I was starting a new relationship with a person that I would eventually become monogamous with. And that definitely it proved to be challenging at times because I was entering into this new sort of paradigm of now I'm kind of moving away from non-monogamy into monogamy because that worked better for that partnership. Ultimately, it didn't really matter, but at the time, I felt like, okay, I need to maybe become monogamous again for this relationship in order to make it work. But as for the three of us, I feel like we just kept getting closer and stronger as a team. And I definitely think that the podcast made that happen. I mean, we knew at that point that we really had something that, people were starting to listen. We had a Patreon that was starting up and, people were joining it. And we knew that we just had to kind of keep going. And we did. And I think that really helped us continue in terms of our relationship as a threesome as well.
But Emily, you also had like some crisis around like, am I allowed to be on the podcast anymore now that I'm in a monogamous relationship?
Yeah, I didn't know. I felt kind of like a fraud. I didn't know if people would want to listen to someone who had been doing it for a while, but then kind of went back and sort of changed the configuration that they were in, that I was in. I was kind of dating only women for a while. That was sort of the one penis policy arrangement of my relationship. And then it ended up becoming just monogamous. And yeah, I constantly was juggling this question of, are people going to even want to listen to me on the show? But thankfully, our wonderful listeners, I found that they enjoyed having that perspective as well, especially people coming into non-monogamy sort of as newbies. It was like, well, here's somebody who kind of sees both sides of it. And we certainly weren't like vilifying monogamy in any way. We weren't saying that it was a bad decision. So I appreciate that people saw the multiple perspectives and really liked that about the show.
Well, it's really the epitome of being in a consciously monogamous relationship. And, it's whenever I've listened to your podcast and you talk about being monogamous, it's never this down, you're not speaking down to monogamy. And I think that's so important. It's like we can all have these have these conversations together. And it's not all about, polyamory being better or non-monogamy being better. It's just like being really actively engaged with communication and with honoring where you're at and where your partner's at. And if that looks like monogamy, then that's wonderful. And also then living the respect for people who are also in non-monogamous relationships as well as a monogamous person, and being able to engage and be part of that. I think it's fantastic that you've stuck with the podcast. I'm so glad that you didn't let it go because you're in a monogamous relationship.
Oh, absolutely. Me too. Thank goodness. It's been one of the greatest things I've ever gotten to do in my life, for sure. I think for all three of us.
Emily's back on our team now, though. She's back in non-monogamy land.
Yes.
That's true. Yes.
Yes. So Emily, the current update.
Yeah, gosh, the current update, long story short there, is that my relationship of 9 years, which I think was, how old am I? I stopped being non-monogamous around 29, and now I'm 36. So I would say, for that basically period of time, 6 to 7 years with my partner, I was monogamous with him. It sort of did end up being a bit of an ultimatum situation. It was either the non-monogamy or the relationship, and I chose the relationship and realized after a period of time, a long period of time, that it definitely sort of also served as a bit of oppression to me. That monogamy wasn't really going to serve me as well as it once did. And not to say that it's not a great choice for a lot of people, because I think it absolutely is. But for me in this current time, now that I'm moving and delving back into non-monogamy and getting to be with multiple people, I feel myself again in a way that I haven't in a very long time. And that's a pretty profound change personally for me.
When we talked to Jessica Fern on the podcast, she talked about this concept of justice jealousy, which I found really interesting. And when you're doing so many episodes, Emily, of Multiamory, and you're looking at Jase and Dedeker having these amazing non-monogamous experiences, did you ever get the sense of like, oh, like I wish I was, team non-monogamy just for a little bit? It must have been a difficult thing to kind of reconcile within your monogamous relationship when you're meeting these brilliant minds on the podcast and interviewing all these incredible people. Like, did that come across your thought patterns?
That's a really interesting question. I think for myself, at the very least, I was able to constantly have all of these wonderful people around me and get to interview and, talk about this subject for so many years, that I knew that it was absolutely a super valid, interesting choice that I probably would want to explore again in my life. I don't know that I was necessarily jealous of it. I think a lot of what I was trying to do was tell myself, okay, I can still do this monogamous thing. I can still figure it out. I can still make it work. But I also knew that non-monogamy was something that I was really interested in, and that it felt very valid and open and honest to me as well. So it's interesting, like kind of being able to hold both at once and not necessarily need to adhere to one specifically for a period of time. I can kind of, I don't know, I found myself to be like more ambi-amorous during that time. But I do think that the state in which I like to be in most is one of non-monogamy.
Well, Emily, I don't know if you'll relate to this, but I think that a factor with being on the show is that, sure, we get to interview all these amazing people and hear their stories and hear about their adventures, but we're also exposed to a lot of the poly hell, right? People's problems and people's issues. And so if anything, I think it helps to serve as what I like to believe that over the years, we've gotten to see a lot of like the reality of non-monogamy, which is not all bad and also not all good all the time.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if because I don't feel like you ever went through any sense of like, oh, the grass is greener on the other side necessarily.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, relationships are relationships, and they're going to be difficult no matter what configuration you're in, what type of relationship structure you're a part of. It's just sort of the people involved and the communication and how well you can do it or not. And I found, unfortunately for myself in my last relationship, I had this just absolute arsenal of tools at my disposal. And no matter what I did, like, it didn't really matter. And that was that relationship. It wasn't necessarily that I was using the wrong tools per se. I just think that we weren't ever at a point where eventually where we could just speak to each other and utilize those tools in an impactful way. And, once you can't do that, then I don't think a relationship is going to work. But I think that would have been the case regardless of whether or not I was monogamous with this person or non-monogamous.
If you're enjoying this conversation, we invite you to show your support for Evolving Love by sharing this episode with someone that you think may enjoy it. Whether it is a lover, family member, or a friend, sharing this episode is a fantastic way to support the work we do here.
For those who would like exclusive access to 2 extra full podcast episodes a month and unlock my full exclusive writing archive, you can become a premium member at evolvingloveproject.substack.com.
We are an independent podcast, and your support means the world to us.
You just spoke about poly hell, and you've spoken to so many people, and you've really experienced the full gamut. The 3 of you are creatives. You're artistic people. You've been in the entertainment industry. You're performers. Liam and I are also creatives, and I'm wondering, from your experience, do you feel like people who are in the arts and who are creative thinkers are just sort of generally a little bit more open to having a more sort of creative type of relationship. And when I mean creative, I mean, like a design your own, like being a little bit more open to non-monogamy.
Yeah, it's funny. You brought up this topic for this episode, and I've been thinking about it since then leading up to this. And something that we've talked about before is how there's this really big overlap between, between the non-monogamy community and then other communities like the sort of nerd, like tabletop game playing, board game playing community, or like the LARPing or historical reenacting community or the Ren Fair community. There's these overlaps that we've seen. And in the past, my hypothesis about why that would be is that if you're part of a community that's outside of the normal, in order to stay in that, you have to develop a certain amount of comfort with doing something that's not normal or that other people would make fun of or look down on. And so if you develop that comfort, it makes it easier to then do other things that are not normal because you already have a certain comfort with like, yeah, okay, I get it. I'm outside of what everyone thinks you should be doing. So I'm comfortable with that. And that's been my theory about that overlap. But then thinking about this overlap with, potentially with creatives and, musicians and actors and people like that, I do wonder if there might be sort of a different overlap there about creativity, that creativity is often in research tied to this ability to make connections that are less obvious or to look for things that are not connected to each other and be able to think about those at the same time versus once I'm on this track, I can only think about things on this one track. And so I could see from that point of view, that idea of if I run into something challenging, going, okay, let me search the sort of creative space around this for what are some other ways to do it. Like you were saying, to build your own relationship, that maybe that trait of thinking about things in a creative way could carry over into this idea of, well, let's try a new thing. Let's see how this works. Let's explore this. And so maybe there's sort of a different kind of mental skill or personality overlap in that area too.
And there's also so many ways in which creativity is about communication as well. So I trained as a jazz musician, and I know, Jase, you love jazz and you play jazz as well. And I think in terms of non-monogamy, I almost imagine like it's like being on a good non-monogamous relationship is like being in a good jazz band where everyone's listening to each other. There is this sense of adventure that could happen. There is this sense of unlimited possibilities. When you're in a good jazz band, it feels like there is a common language and a common conversation that can take place. And when you're not in a great band where people aren't actually listening to each other on stage, it feels like everyone's blocking each other. And maybe that's because they don't have the necessary technical skills. So in a non-monogamous context, maybe it's they don't know your radar, for example. They don't know how to have these ways to manage through these difficult discussions. But there's so much overlap between communication and artistic pursuits and non-monogamy, I think.
I love that metaphor. That's really fun.
Yeah, what that's making me think of, though, is at the same time, I think within the non-monogamous community, especially I think on the more like polyamorous side of it, we see a lot of people really craving structure, and I think that was something that went into when we were creating the radar framework, is a little bit of like people really want structure, because they're doing things that maybe they've never done before, where there's not a lot of social cues and social scripts given to them already. And so people really want structure, right? And that goes from everything. And I think that's why we see this explosion of resources online right now, because I think people are really, really craving that structure. And I guess to think about that within the terms of creativity with like a jazz band, I think it's kind of like we all know the rules in the sense that like we can all read sheet music and we can all understand chords and we can all understand rhythm. So it's like we know the rules so that then we can play with them and we can break them potentially, right? Which is different if we don't know what the structure is and we're just going in like kind of willy-nilly. Maybe this is me getting a little too deep into the metaphor, but
I love it. Let's just keep going.
Let's keep getting deep into the metaphor. It's great.
No, I will say I feel like there are certain people that are a little bit more risk adverse, and that being non-monogamous sometimes can feel really risky, especially at the beginning. And it can cause you to have to break outside of your comfort zone. And those who just sort of want to be a little bit more comfortable, maybe somebody who's not necessarily as creative, for instance, who isn't open to taking big risks in their relationships and in their life, that may be a little bit more challenging for them. I found in some people that I've dated that they really struggle with that. They really struggle with going up against just the feeling of unknown. Like, I'm not sure what's about to happen. I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to handle a situation. I'm not sure how to react to these emotions that are happening in my body that I've never never felt before. So I don't know if that has to do with being a creative person or not, or just being someone who is open to the possibility of doing something that they've never done before and that they're not used to and that could challenge them.
And it also makes me think a little bit about time. Many people who I talk to, they say, oh, I'd love to be, non-monogamous, or it sounds great. I can get on board with the theory and all of that. But I just don't have the time because I'm working a 9-to-5 job where I have to be out the door at, 7:30 in the morning, drop the kids to care or to school. And then, I'm not home until 6:30 p.m. And I think that there is something also about a creative's lifestyle. I mean, everyone's lifestyle is different, but where it can be sort of unusual work hours as well. And depending on what sort of creativity that you're into, if you were into something like, musical theatre, that element of performing, you're bonding with people, in a way, connecting with them in a way with the hours and what you're going through, the emotional journey of being in production with somebody and the intensity of that. You can get in deep with people in a way that you probably wouldn't really do if you were working like a 9-to-5 job.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all three of us can relate to that because we all have our backgrounds in theater and musical theater that, I know that was a thing where for myself personally, even before I was exploring non-monogamy, it was this weird thing that I didn't quite know how to describe to people, like when you bond with someone from a show, right? Or you create your little show family for a while. And then for a while, I know in early college when I was getting my theater degree, my first boyfriend in college was not a theater person, not a creative at all, right? He was studying something completely different. And it was so hard for him to understand. And he was a little scared of it also. And then once you rope in things, the added layer of and this person is playing my wife in the show and we kiss on stage or stuff like that. Then when you're playing around with those dynamics, that can be really fun and really interesting. It is a weird thing for people to wrap their heads around for sure. And so, yeah, I do think, especially with the arts like theater, where we're literally trying on different roles and different versions of ourselves and literally being I'm going to try on being in a relationship with this person, even though it's not real. I think it does open up certain pathways for playing around with relationship and what it could be like and what it could feel like in general.
Can I take some metaphors and run with them a little bit and see where it goes?
Please. Let's go running. It's the Olympics after all, so let's get into the mood.
Yes, right. My favorite.
Yes. While we were talking about this and what Emily was saying about the kind of fear of the unknown or the uncertainty or the unpredictability and how comfortable you are with that, that's something that was making me think about writing music. So my degree in college was music composition. And so I had to write a lot of music each semester for that. And what I found was that every single piece that I wrote, I ended up having to kind of reinvent my process for how I do that for every single one. I didn't fall into this sense of, oh yeah, this is kind of how I get there. There was, one that I went and saw a play that really moved me and went out with my music paper, in the park outside because it was nice outside and, sketched out the melodies that I was thinking of based on that play that I had just seen. Whereas there was another one where I covered the whole floor of my dorm room in paper and was drawing shapes on it. And that's how I was kind of big squiggly lines of here's how I want this orchestra piece to all fit together. And each one was this totally different process. Some where I'm using a guitar or a piano or something else entirely to try to, I guess, find some way to be creative and to make something. And so I do think that in that process, I had to develop this sense of, I'm not just going to find this one thing that works and I'm always just going to plug in the formula and do it and then I'm done. Instead, it's this sense of, I'm going to have to reinvent things all the time and maybe take what worked at other times and apply those. And I think about relationships that very much applies. This sense of one, in each relationship, it's not like I can apply the same tools in the same way and it's going to work in this new relationship. I might have to tweak things a little bit. It might be a little different. And then like I think about my relationship with Dedeker, where, you know, we've been together now for coming up on 11 years. And the way that we've approached things and the way that we even conduct our radars, for example, has changed a lot over the years because we're always adapting, and it's not just you find the one thing and you do it. And I think that's the narrative that traditional fairy tales and monogamy that all end after the happily ever after kind of leads us astray, is this idea that once you find the good thing, it just stays like that forever and doesn't take adaptation or maintenance or anything like that, which is not true for anyone, regardless of your type of relationship. But that expectation, I feel like, can be prevalent in our culture. And so, I don't know, I guess I would argue a little bit of that flexibility is good for anyone, but probably especially so for non-monogamous people, because there are these different relationships, and also you're doing something where there are fewer examples to follow. And so you've kind of got to come up with it as you're going. Yeah, I think it's better now. There are more role models and more examples now, but there's still not as many as we have for monogamous relationships.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that. Liam and I, people often ask us, you know, are you open relationship or are you polyamorous, or where are you at? Like, what is your label? You know, what bracket are you under? And like for us, we've never really connected with that. It's sort of just like when we look back into our past, we can sort of see the evolution and like the journey of it. You know, what I would have been I wouldn't have been comfortable with some of the, you know, our expressions of non-monogamy that we're having now in the early days, but I wasn't sort of who I am now. So now I'm like, yes, I'm, please do go and date separately. Please form a lovely connection, all of that. Where in the beginning, that would have been my nightmare. I was open to non-monogamy, but it had to look like this. So, we try not to say, what type of strict relationship style we're under, and I feel like it's pretty hot ground anyway these days.
Could I want to do one other thing to continue my metaphor about the music writing thing, and maybe the music playing as well, to go to what you were saying about time and not having enough time. And what's interesting is I've found in my life for the last several years, and what started this was the pandemic, where I had a breakup like right before that. And so then wasn't really dating much at all during the height of the pandemic. And then also got a lot busier with work. And so simultaneously, I haven't been playing in any bands in several years. And also haven't really dated anyone in several years. And so thinking about the time thing, I'm like, yes, I can very much relate to, not even from a sense of I wish I could do that. I'm like, I do this, but I'm just not practicing it as much. And I find with both music and non-monogamy, there is that question of how do I keep this thing in my life? Because it does matter to me, even if I don't feel like I have the time or just the energy bandwidth to be fully doing it, right? Like to be in a band and do as much as I used to. I'm like, God, the idea of being up until 3 a.m, 1 or 2 nights a week, like that sounds horrible now. Like that's not as appealing to me. Maybe if my schedule drastically changed, it'd be cool. But finding some ways to still do music, have that in my life, writing some songs now and then by myself, or doing music on the computer. And then the same with the non-monogamy thing of staying connected to that community and knowing that I can have flirtations and things without the guilt that can be associated with that in a monogamous relationship, and kind of saying like, oh yeah, that possibility's there, even if I'm not actively pursuing it. I guess maybe like being single in a way, if you're not actively seeking to date, it's like, yeah, but the possibility is always there. If I feel like I want to, I can. So I don't know. That's just trying to think about how this metaphor applies to all the things you're bringing up.
Yeah.
This through line of creativity, even though we're talking about it, in the music context, in the performing arts context, is often a lot of the non-monogamous people that we know through our communities, through our conversation nights and the different things that we do in this space, the most creative people are often not necessarily performing artists. You know, we have met these incredibly creative doctors or teachers or, you know, any profession you could possibly think of, and they would consider themselves not very creative people. And when I talk to them and talk about how they approach their life and how they approach their beautiful relationship structures, I'm thinking, you are as creative as it gets. Like, this is actually what creativity is. And I think there is that beautiful link that really joins that together.
Yeah, I could definitely relate to that. I know for myself, because I've been working with clients, primarily with non-monogamous clients, for also almost 10 years now, a little under 10 years now. And every single time, I think that I've seen every possible arrangement, every possible agreement, every possible format of relationship, like someone comes along with something entirely brand new, right? That again, they have had to pull on some amount of creative power to be able to create some sort of relationship that works for them and the person or the people that they're connecting with, right? And so, yeah, I think there's definitely something there of like, I think there has to be a willingness to be able to find some of that creativity. You know, there has to be a willingness to like try something new, experiment with something new. Whether that's a full-on particular format of relationship or even just like little day-to-day things of like, hey, my partner and I are disagreeing on this thing, or like we're coming up against something that's not working for us, like the way we're splitting domestic labor is not working for us, or the way that we're communicating about your other partner is not working for us. Like, can we come up with an experiment to try something different for the next 2 weeks? You know, like there has to be some sort of willingness to go there. And I think you can't go there with somebody. Like, I think you can't pull on any kind of creative power or creative collaboration with somebody, like if you're not feeling heard, if you're not feeling respected, if you're feeling scared, if you're feeling traumatized, you know, things like that. And so I do think that's at least for me, a big driving force of the show, which is of like, how do we get people feeling more secure in their relationships and feeling more empowered to create with somebody else? I think that's the big thing, is like, how can we inspire people to realize like, oh, you don't have to be stuck in this particular communication pattern. You don't have to be stuck in this particular type of relationship. You don't have to be stuck in these particular loops with a partner. Like, you can empower yourself individually and empower yourselves together to try something new, to do something new, to change things. So like, yeah, I do think there's something there of like inspiring people to have the willingness and bravery to get more creative in their relationships and in their communication.
Jase, you said something before about not dating so much at the moment and, you know, just doing what's right for you. And I think that's really amazing, especially considering like you do have this platform, you know, the three of you, you know, you have such a big, amazing voice in the non-monogamous space. I'm really interested to know, have you found that having the podcast sort of weighs in on the way that you now sort of approach dating and your relationships? Like, because I feel like people might, you know, they look at you as these, you know, these beacons of wisdom. And then I'm really interested to know how that shows up for you personally as individuals who would want to just connect with people on a person-to-personal level, not like multiamory, you know, and dating.
Something we talk about a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a doozy.
Yeah. The joke that we make is that, you know, when we started this show, was thinking, oh, great, this is going to, you know, broaden our horizons, give us more people to connect with. And what it's actually done is kind of eliminate almost all possibilities for connection because of what you were describing. And it is, it is a challenge that at non-monogamy, like polyamory, I should say that, polyamory flavor of non-monogamy, in any kind of event in that area, you know, there's still people who've never listened to our podcast, or people who don't like it, which I'm ironically, the people that are like, yeah, it's not really for me. I'm like, oh, hey, maybe we could hang out, because you don't have this pre-existing parasocial relationship with me. We could actually start as just two people who don't know each other at all. And you know, it's like, ironically, that's appealing. But there is, it is. There's a whole bunch of things to it, right? Because on the one hand, there's this parasocial relationship where people feel like they know a lot about us and feel like they know who we are. And then usually the concern there is that, well, when you meet the real me, it's going to be disappointing because I'm not this perfect beacon who always does everything right and who always communicates perfectly, even though that's my goal and that's what I, want everyone to be better at, including myself. But, I'm not that ideal. Same as if you, dated some famous actor or something. It's like they aren't the person that you think they are necessarily because they're a full human being with a lot more depth to them.
Totally.
And then there's also, just stuff of like, okay, well, how then do we catch up the other way around of me getting to know you as much as you think you know me while also correcting what you think you know about me? And, that's challenging. But then I think there's also this complicated aspect of the power dynamic. And that's not to say power, in a really explicit, like I'm your boss and can give you a job or like if I'm a movie producer or something, that power dynamic. It's more this power dynamic that comes in if I give an opinion about how I think communication should go or about how I think non-monogamy should be done or how I want my relationships to go. It can then have this extra weight of, well, the expert says it should be done this way. And I know that Dedeker and Emily, you've both run into the same thing, especially if you're dating someone who's newer to it. Right? If they've been doing it 10 years, whatever, they're going to be like, yeah, okay, you think you know it. I think I know it too. But with newer people, there's kind of this, like you get taken too seriously instead of it being a collaboration. To go back to the music metaphor, it'd kind of be like in that jazz band, if you have the one experienced person and all the other people are new and they're all just kind of trying to follow that person and you can end up in this just kind of lifeless, it just doesn't work, right?
Well, Emily, you are presumably getting out onto the dating scene potentially, and if I remember correctly, you just moved to New York as well. Is that right?
I did. Yeah, I am getting out there. It has proven to be mostly new people who don't know a lot about non-monogamy, but are willing to be to learn, and they're kind of interested in it. But there is again that dynamic of, okay, I have such a paradigm shift towards thinking about things from a non-monogamous lens that sometimes it's surprising to me to hear the other side of things, to hear like, well, this is what's being, triggering a reaction in me, and this is what's really challenging for me. And it's hard to almost think back and remember like, oh yeah, that's the thing that people get upset about. And that's the thing that's challenging for people. I forgot about that because it hasn't happened to me in years and years. So that is really interesting. It's interesting going back and trying to sort of usher people into this different way of thinking, and also trying to be very gentle and very careful and very understanding of the challenges that arise just from being a newbie again, from somebody, going through this for the very first time. It's really difficult. It's been a long time since I did that, and seeing it in other people who I date, I don't envy that position. And I understand that like I have a task of trying to help as much as I possibly can in that way, while also knowing that they have to do their own work and that it's not all on me. It's an interesting place to be in that I've also just been sort of going through for the first time after a really long time of not being in a non-monogamous configuration. At some point, I'll date somebody again who knows what they're doing, and that'll be cool. But right now, I haven't done that yet.
Well, but there's also, like Emily, you were sharing about earlier in your past relationship about feeling like, I've acquired all these tools for the podcast that I feel like aren't working or that I can't bring to the table. And like, I've had that experience as well, where to rope in what Jase was saying about the power dynamic, that sometimes I've been in relationships where I'm like, ooh, like, I think, at Multiamory, we created this really interesting tool that could probably help in this particular situation, but I don't want to be the one swooping in to be like, hey, you.
Buy my book.
Right.
Yeah.
You need to use my tool that I created for this situation, because I'm the one who knows how to solve what's going on between us. So you better shape up, right? Like, I don't want to do that. And so, yeah, I think there is this interesting dynamic where I feel like with seeking any kind of partnership now, at least the things that I'm filtering for are things like, does this person have an independent relationship to non-monogamy that's independent from me? That's a big one for me right now, is like, and have they interfaced with resources that are not my resources? And even if that's even better, like, have they formed an independent philosophy about relationship separate from me? And sometimes that's surprisingly difficult to find. Not that it's about me necessarily, but it is about this weird thing of like, when you create one of the more popular resources in non-monogamy, then finding people who have consumed other resources but not your resource is actually a little bit difficult to filter for.
Everyone listens to Multiamory.
That's what it feels like sometimes.
Well,
it's amazing.
It's amazing, of course, and everyone should. And I'm sure everyone listening to this has probably listened. But if they don't and aren't already avid fans, they've got to check it out. But that sense of finding community and finding those people who are great people to date. Jase and Dedeker, you've obviously just moved country, and I'm really interested to know how it's been finding that sense of community in Japan, because one of the reasons we started Evolving Love and Abby started to share her writing, and then we started to have conversations when we moved back from New York to Canberra, which is where we live, was that we weren't able to find that sense of non-monogamous community that we had in New York, which we had a really great group of friends and we felt really supported. So I wonder, as you make this shift, how are you going about finding that sense of community and finding people that potentially you could date or, potentially you could, hang out and chat about all these things with?
Yeah, well, I'll start out by first saying that our move is not fully permanent yet. That's kind of all still in progress. But to get to the heart of your question, I'll answer for myself first and then Dedeker can jump in. But for me, I think one is that just as far as community in general goes, because of moving around quite a lot over the last bunch of years, 8 years or something like that, I find that I have friends that I feel very close with all over the country and the US and sometimes around the world. And so connecting with them online through, doing group hangouts on video calls or, playing games together, like that type of online community has become more of a normal way of connecting for me and a way of still feeling connected to a community, which is a cool thing we can do in this day and age where we're all live on a call right now in, all across the world, all on different continents from each other, which is wild. But as far as connecting to community, I mean, with Japan, we've been coming here for several months out of the year, every year for quite a while. And so there's a polyamory community that's a Japanese language community based out of Tokyo primarily, although they'll do meetups in other cities as well. And we're not in Tokyo, so that's a little bit harder to have access to because they only sometimes do events in our area. And then there's an English language group also based out of Tokyo that's mostly expats as well as some Japanese people there as well. And so we've connected with those communities, but it's not anything that we've been super active in. I think, Dedeker, you've been to just a couple of them. I think I've only been to a few as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird thing. Like, I'll say that, again, like kind of splitting time between the States and between Japan, it is, I mean, from an intellectual standpoint, it is really interesting to see how like the Japanese non-monogamous community is evolving in very different ways from, communities in the US. The community in Japan, both on the English speaking side and the Japanese speaking side, like there's still a lot of overlap with the queer community, with the kink community, right? Because these communities, I think by volume are still relatively small, right? And so they kind of all have to glom together a little bit. But also, like, this is a culture where we're coming from a very different set of values around monogamy and relationships. Whether it's more restrictive or less restrictive than like relationship values in the States, like I think that's very, very debatable. But yeah, it's something that I'm still kind of feeling into. And to be honest, for myself, like my biggest sense of community has come from connecting with other podcasters, other educators, other creators, like over the past couple of years, I've gotten very close with Libby Sinback of the Making Polyamory Work podcast and Rachel Krantz, who put out a book about non-monogamy a few years ago, and Dr. Jolie Hamilton and Marie Tuan, who just put out her book. Like, there's been a certain level of like connecting to people who are also in this same or a similar position of thinking about this and educating and talking and writing and kind of creating content around it. That's helped me to feel like a little bit more seen and a little bit more held to a certain extent.
There's a funny other piece of trivia is that Dedeker and I both recently got new Japanese tutors for ourselves independently of each other. And both of them are themselves podcasters. And I think that has helped give us kind of a touch point to connect with them.
I love that.
I thought the twist was going to be, and now you're both dating. Both dating your...
Yeah, well, we'll see where it goes. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
I think it's wonderful to have that sense of community with the other podcasters as well, and be chatting with people who just sort of get it, because it is a really unusual position to be in. And just someone to message to just say a crazy thing. I mean, not crazy, but I once went on a date. It was a first date. I was so excited. We'd been messaging. He actually drove to Canberra. He was coming through from Melbourne, so it's like a 7-hour drive from Melbourne to Canberra.
Wow.
Anyway, he walked into the bar and he sat down and he said, "Wow, I've just listened to like 5 of your episodes and I'm midway through one right now." And he's like basically taking out his thing, and I was just like, oh my gosh. And like the difference of that and how familiar he was, and I just felt so far behind.
Such an asymmetry.
So it would have been, lovely to be able to message, somebody else who can empathize and be like, hey, this thing just happened, and have someone be like, yeah, that's just wild. That's happened to me too.
I went on a first date for the first time in a long time back in June or so. And, but like I messaged with this person for like a couple months. We'd met in person before. And there was a particular point where when I was kind of evaluating, do I actually want to go on a date with this person? Am I feeling the vibes? I don't know. Like again, like it's hard to navigate this, but I kind of did have to like ask him very point blank of like, I need you to be really honest about like what you actually know about me, and like how much you've listened to the show and like what you know about my life already. And I explained this dynamic, right? Because this is a weird dynamic to go into, if someone knows a whole lot. And I anticipate that's probably going to be a question I'm going to have to ask more people in the future as well. And I don't know, when I say it out loud, it sounds so pompous. I'm
right?
Just,
it's
like
such a
it makes me
struggle.
sound like I'm so full of myself. But it feels important.
No, I think it's lovely to be able to have the opportunity where it's like you are meeting in a more balanced space and where they're not fully across everything. I had something, a couple of months ago, I was dating somebody, and he recently, he had just sort of come across the Evolving Love thing as well, where we have a lot of info about us. And he actually made the point of saying, look, I've just, I've checked out a little bit, but I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop checking it out. Like I'm really looking forward to dating you and getting to know you. And I want to check it out at some point because it looks really awesome. And I've listened to one episode, but I just want to leave it at that. And that made me feel really comfortable. And, we're still having a lovely connection.
That's great.
So I think the takeaway, if anyone's listening, if you think any of the 5 of us are like hotties that you want to date, stop listening right now.
No, gosh,
right this
never
moment.
mind. No, stop.
It's like the anti-plug.
Exactly.
We are aware of your time, and we just want to say thank you so much for making the time across all the continents to have this chat with us. But if you are listening to this and you don't find us attractive at all, and you would love to listen to the Multiamory podcast and read the book, where's the best place for them to find it?
Sure. You can find us wherever you would like to listen to a podcast out there, whether it be Spotify or whether it be, Apple, iTunes, even on YouTube, you can find us. We're the Multiamory podcast. We're on Instagram as well at Multiamory_podcast. And yeah, our book came out last year. It's a little over a year old now. It's called Multiamory Essential Tools for Modern Relationships. And it basically is all of our most, I guess, listened to tools, most famous tools, as it were. The favorite ones that we like to reference a lot on the show. And it's written in book form. And so, hopefully you can use it as sort of an additional resource as you're working your way through the podcast.
And you can get it wherever you get books. If you have an independent bookstore nearby, ask them to carry it. That's super cool. But you can also get it on, Amazon, on your Kindle, or Barnes and Noble. Put it on your Nook if anyone has one of those still. All those options are available too.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for making the time. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with the three of you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Evolving Love podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback and support fuels our passion, and together we're building a community of curiosity, kindness, and growth.
If you would like to show your support and are interested in accessing 2 extra podcast episodes each month, along with access to my exclusive writing, you can become a premium subscriber over at evolvingloveproject.substack.com. Subscribe, comment, and let's keep the conversation going.